All right, just a little lay of the land here. We talk about in this part of Mark the authority of Christ. The third discussion of authority is broadly connected with discipleship, and now we've seen, as I was indicating, three separate treatments of discipleship, each of which seems to be elevating the status of the disciples. So first of all, they're basically crowd control, kind of the most rudimentary. Last week we saw the disciples elevated to the status of being Jesus' representatives, his agents, as you might say, and actually entrusted with authority that would actually be capable of casting out demons. But now this week, the elevation goes even further, and we're going to find that the disciples, in a sense, displace the very family of Christ. Who is my mother? Jesus says. Who are my brothers? And looking at the disciples, here are my brothers and my sister and my mother. It's a powerful statement, shocking statement, really, especially in light of ancient Jewish culture. And that's what we're looking at, and that's this 15-verse section that we're considering this morning. So I gave you this last week, just a reminder. This is called a Markan sandwich. Mark has this distinctive literary structure in which he starts with a premise. In this case, the family of Jesus comes and wants to restrain him. They want to bind him. It ends with the other half of the sandwich, the other piece of bread, if you will, in which we now find that this family, which was misguided in its interest, is in a sense displaced by a different family. What made the difference? The middle section, the meat as it's sometimes called, in which instead of being bound, Jesus will do the binding. He is going to bind a strong man. And the true family of Christ are those who are going to join him in this binding enterprise. And so the whole thing is kind of a neatly packed package of ideas. There's a lot of moving parts in here, and so there's a lot to cover, but that's kind of the basic structure of what's going on. Verse 21, when his own people heard about this, they went out to lay hold of him, for they said, he's out of his mind. I covered verse 20 last week, so I'm skipping by it. But what they heard of was all the crowds that are milling around, crowds that are really virtually threatening Jesus. You recall that kind of mob mentality. And it seems that word of this had reached the family of Jesus there in Nazareth, and they made that not minor trip from Nazareth to Capernaum, apparently on a rescue mission. So they hear about what's going on. It seems that things are spinning out of control. They're worried about Jesus' welfare, possibly, and so they come to lay hold on him because they said he's out of his mind. At this point, the text does not say family. It says his own people. But most commentators agree that that is referring to the family, and certainly later in the text they are expressly mentioned. So it seems this is kind of a generic way of referring to them. Those who should have been his most ardent supporters, his family, his closest intimates, we would say humanly speaking, are now ironically opposing him. They're coming at least with a design of protecting him, possibly from the crowds that at least earlier we heard were threatening him. The word that Mark uses here to lay hold of him, this is your Greek lesson now for the day, kratesai. Kratesai, the beginning four letters, K-R-A-T, krat, are the words that come into English in various political terms, like autocrat, democrat, and other words like that. The word democrat, means power in the people, the demos. Autocrat means a person who has personal power. The kind of power in view here, however, is coercive power. This is not necessarily dignified power. It's the power you have over someone when you pull a gun on them and hold it to their head. It's just raw, coercive power. And that seems to be the sense that Mark wants us to get in our minds here. The family is coming not to reason with Jesus, not to have a conversation, but just to lay hold on him. Put him in a straitjacket. Get him out of here. Whether or not they really wanted or really thought that he was out of his mind is a debated point. I think it was Ann last week asked the question, do you think that's really what Mary thought? I mean, she was there at his birth after all. She knew better. Would she actually have entertained that? I don't know. Maybe in their minds they thought even these circumstances were kind of carrying them away. Maybe this was purely pretense. Who knows? But one thing or another, they were saying the guy has lost it. He's nuts. That was the official party line by which the family wanted to get Jesus out from under this apparent threat of the crowd. It was interesting to me reflecting on this, how many people in church history have been accused of being out of their minds when they really were devoted to doing the work of Christ. The Apostle Paul, as you know, was accused of having gone mad. Much learning has made you mad, was the accusation of Festus there when Paul was speaking before Agrippa II. Francis of Assisi, who wanted to take the monkish life out of the monastery and into the streets, was accused frequently of being a madman. Well, I've mentioned William Carey before. He was accused by many of his contemporaries of being mad, an insane man, because he wanted to do something so unthinkable, so ridiculous, to take the gospel, one guy, to all of India? Come on, you know. Sinclair Lewis wrote an early story about a man who had a project for organizing what he called, quote, Society for the Promotion of Madness among the respectable classes. And the commentator who pointed this out said, that wouldn't be a bad name for a Christian church, would it? You know, that maybe sometimes we're a little bit too dignified, too orderly, too respectful, too worried about reputation. Well, Jesus Christ, the universal consensus of history is that he was not out of his mind. He was the sanest man who ever lived. And in fact, through all the crises of human history, it's amazing how often Jesus comes out looking better. There was a widespread quote after World War I, the Great War. The only man who came out of it with an enhanced reputation was Jesus Christ. Everybody else was bloodied up. Everybody else had egg on their face, not to mention the huge loss of life. And that, of course, was only a run-up to World War II, but somehow Christ and the Christian message survived intact. Well, his family said he's out of his mind. The scribes went one better. The scribes came down from Jerusalem and said, he has Beelzebub. And by the ruler of the demons, he casts out demons. I've talked at some length about the scribes before, so I won't take time on that. But you know that they are the scholar class. They are the people who are supposed to have the answers and who, being best informed in the wisdom of the Scriptures, are supposed to be able to give the most acute analysis of life in light of the Scriptures. And so they propose a different theory for Jesus' alleged mental illness. The interesting thing about the scribes is they don't come on the scene simply denying that Jesus does these miracles. In fact, it's probably safe to say the most conspicuous and famous thing about Jesus was he was a miracle worker. They don't come saying, well, the guy's an illusionist. He's just pulling rabbits out of a hat here, and if we could look a little closer, we'd see this isn't real. They don't do that. In fact, there's never a record of anybody actually accusing Jesus of just being kind of engaged in sleight of hand. Nobody seems to have doubted that the man was doing these incredible, inexplicable displays of power and miracle. That's a universal testimony that comes down about Jesus of Nazareth. So the scribes put to the task of trying to explain this, float the hypothesis that he sold his soul to the devil. We, of course, have that in literature and so on, that idea. Somebody sells their soul. The idea is that you get some immediate benefit, some great power, some great talent, but someday payday is going to show up. And so the implication of this was Jesus had sold his soul to the devil, but soon enough he was going to have to pay the price, and it was coming thus as a warning against people inclined to follow Jesus that you're taking a path to a bad place with him. The very fact that the scribes would do this, I think in the first place must astonish us. If we had in our experience somebody who was performing unbelievable displays of power, miracle among us. And we found ourselves in the position of, in a hostile way, simply dismissing it or even assigning it to the work of the devil. You might wonder, what's wrong with your mind? I mean, what is this that you would do such a thing? I think we have the idea that miracle should convince people of the truth of God. I think I've told you at some time along the way, a little embarrassing story of mine. When I was back in college, I had a roommate, a man that I love then and love now. His name is Ron. He had cerebral palsy, brilliant, but he had this impairment from birth. And I got it in my head that if I could get a few friends of mine to, with me, fast for a week and pray like mad, God would heal him. And so we did that. We fasted for a week and prayed that God would heal Ron. And I'll tell you, I had a couple of motives. I, of course, loved my roommate, and I wanted God to heal him, and I thought, that'd be a great thing. But I also thought to myself, wow, can you imagine all the people that would come to faith in Christ? And this was Whitworth in the late 60s. A lot of people there did need to come to Christ, that's what I'm saying, And so I thought, this is it. This is going to spark a revival. There's going to be this amazing renewal, turning to Christ. And of course, the week went by, we prayed, and Ron was not healed. And I was devastated for a while, but later, it did kind of occur to me, I'm not sure even if God had healed him, it would have actually brought anybody to faith. Because the biblical testimony is that if a person will not hear the self-authenticating message of Christ in the Scriptures, they won't believe even if somebody performs great miracles. Jesus says they won't believe even if somebody rises from the dead. Miracle by itself, without grace, without God changing the heart in conjunction with the miracle, only teaches people how to hate God more intelligently. That's all you wind up with. The great example of that biblically is Pharaoh. Wave after wave, plague after plague. Any self-respecting Pharaoh should have figured it out. Ain't gonna win this battle. This is the true God. I better bow the knee. You see, why didn't he get that? And yet what we find is that every one of those plagues just brought him back with more severe, determined hardness. A battle he couldn't win, and yet he was refusing to surrender. You see, that's what miracle does without grace. And the reason we hear a little later, we haven't read it yet, but the reason we hear a little later in this text about what's sometimes called the unpardonable sin is because these scribes are getting awfully close. They're looking at something that is perfectly obviously the work of God and calling it evil, calling it the devil's work. And when you begin to see that attitude going on, you see something that begins to resemble this that in an awesome kind of way the Bible calls an unpardonable sin. We'll look at that text in a few minutes. Well, the scribes come and they don't attribute the healing power of Christ to God. They attribute it to Beelzebub. Beelzebub is from two words, Baal, which was the generic name for the Canaanite gods. Baal is not one particular god, but many. It's kind of the generic term for all of them, or the prince of them. So in the Old Testament, you hear of Baal worship, and that really is referring to those Canaanite pagan deities. Zebub meant prince. And so really it stood for the idea of the prince of the Canaanite gods, but it had become a kind of colloquialism in the Jewish world for the prince of the powers of hell. They, of course, dismissing those Canaanite gods, attributed rather the name to this that was hellish power, demonic power, and so that was kind of a term that was used in that sense. You'll hear the term Lord of the Flies. It's because of a certain linguistic similarity between the words Beelzebub and Lord of the Flies, so that comes down in literature, and I won't bother you with it right now. But nevertheless, it was a common reference to Satan, the prince of the demons. Well, Jesus, of course, is aware of this accusation, and so he calls the scribes to himself and said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. He called the scribes to him. That's virtually the way this text is always read. So here is Jesus responding to the accusation that he's doing these things in league with the devil. He spoke to them in parables. Actually, the questions we just read are the setup to the parable. The parable itself is about a strong man who is plundered. That's the parable. So we'll see that in just a moment. It's one of the most important parables in all the Gospel of Mark. It is considered thematic that Jesus is pictured by Mark as the one who comes to plunder this strong man who has usurped control of this world. We've talked about this back in chapter 1. The picture is that Satan inserted himself illegitimately into the rule of this world, and we're the ones that put him there. In the garden, we obeyed Satan rather than God. And at that point, he became the prince of this world, the prince of the power of the air. He could say with a straight face to Jesus at the temptation, all of these things are mine. I can give them to who I want. Because at least for a time, he had that kind of control in this world. Jesus came to take it back, you see. Jesus came to tie that strong man up and plunder his house. And so that's the parable, which is presented to us here, but really is an overshadowing notion that runs through the whole Gospel of Mark. Jesus sets up that parable with this series of rhetorical questions. How can Satan cast out Satan? I love to quote from one commentator who sort of saw in this great theme of history. He said, quote, "This is a question with penetrating force. Can evil power be destroyed by yet greater evil? People have thought they can cast out cruelty by more cruelty, violence by more violence, war by more war. But can the truth ever be established by lies? Liberty by repression, religion by compulsion. Human history is the story of fighting fire with fire, and when it's all said and done, what you see are a lot of ashes, you know. And that kind of warfare is, at least in the average situation, not very successful. Can Satan cast out Satan? Jesus says, a house divided against itself cannot stand, which is one of those many biblical phrases that works its way into popular culture, colloquialisms. We've all heard the expression out there, a house divided against itself, you know. Many people have heard that phrase and don't know it comes from Jesus. Abraham Lincoln used that with such great effect in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, many people thought it came from Lincoln, you know. Lincoln, however, got it from Jesus because you remember as a young man, he studied the Bible at night in candlelight. Remember all those pictures of Lincoln? That's where he got that, and that's the source that we should recognize as well. Well, Jesus says if Satan has risen up against himself, he is divided, he cannot stand, but has an end. There's a subtlety to this statement that we need to be sure to catch. In a sense, Jesus is saying here, no matter how you cut it, Satan's days are now very, very short indeed. It's as if Jesus is saying, let's just grant, for the sake of argument, that I am in league with the devil. Let's just allow for a moment that you're right. If I am in league with the devil, then it means that Satan has indeed risen up against himself. He is divided, and in fact, he cannot stand. He has an end. Even given your hypothesis, Satan is losing this battle because he's divided against himself. The fact of the matter is, Jesus didn't come in league with the devil. He came in league with heaven. He came as God himself among us to take back, to plunder the house of the strong man. And so looking at it in that light, Satan's days are also over. The whole point of this is, any way you look at it, Satan's control of this world is now coming to a crashing and decisive and dramatic conclusion, and that is probably one of the central meanings of the incarnation of Christ, is the change that took place in human history with the dismantling of Satan's power. So it goes to the whole deep purpose of Christ in history to destroy the works of the devil, and that is, of course, thematic not only in Mark, but in all the New Testament. Then this very powerful statement, "No one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man, then he will plunder his goods." So we first must bind the strong man. Jesus came to bind Satan. He came to restrain him. His family had come, Jesus' family had come to restrain Jesus. But Jesus is the restrainer, not the restrainee here. He's come to be the plunderer. He's come to be the restrainer. This phrase, this idea goes through the New Testament. And so we virtually in every book of the New Testament will hear something about Satan being dismantled in his authority. Paul says in Romans chapter 16 that Christian people are about to crush the head of Satan under their feet. We hear in 1 John, he came to destroy the works of the devil. We hear that kind of language. There's a very significant aspect of New Testament teaching that relates to the idea that the life of Christ came to destroy Satan's authority in this world. I think the most dramatic expression of it is in the book of Revelation, which is a text that I believe is misunderstood so often. It's tragic because it should be a great encouragement to us. This is in Revelation chapter 20. "Then I saw an angel, Christ himself, coming down from heaven, having the key to the abyss, holding a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He cast him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to prevent him from deceiving the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were finished. Then he must be set free for a short time." We do a grave, in my humble opinion, a grave disservice to Christian understanding by making that refer to something in our future when in fact it refers to something in our past. Satan has already been bound. Christ has already bound him. He's lost his place in heaven. He's been kicked out of that position of prestige. And now we are in a situation where he is locked in the abyss. Now the abyss is not hell. In Revelation, the abyss is the place where Satan controls. But the whole point here is that anywhere Jesus goes, anywhere his gospel is preached, Satan has to run for cover. The history of Christian missions is that Christian missionaries have found people cowering in fear of a universe, spirited by all kinds of superstitious haunts that leave them with this feeling of constant dread about a mysterious universe that they don't understand, and all they can do is tremble before it. And the light of Christ comes in and teaches them, no, Christ is king. You don't need to live in fear of this universe. And a sensible way of life comes to people, and they look at the universe more rationally, and they begin to do science, and they begin to progress in their way of thinking about how we should live in this place. And we're no longer living in dread of a superstitiously haunted universe, because Christ drives out the darkness. He drives Satan back into the abyss. And we are living in this wonderful time of having the power of Christ through his word at our disposal in every place we go and in everything we do, be it scientific or political or commercial or personal, whatever it is. The light of Christ freeing us from the ravaging fearfulness that comes at the hands of Satan. It's a battle that's going on constantly. I suspect, friends, it's going on in this gymnasium right now. I think if we had Frodo's ring, we could see that the power of Christ is waging war against the power of Satan, and he's running for cover. Do you believe that? Are we believing that God is in fact at work, and that through us, his modest and rather unlikely people, broken pots, he is in fact driving back the very gates of hell? But that's what's happening if the biblical witness is true, and that's what Jesus accomplished when he bound Satan. for 1,000 years. 1,000 in the Bible just means a real big number. You understand that. It's just this protracted period in which we now live. I can't take credit for that. Of course, that interpretation of that text goes back to the great St. Augustine, and I think he got the right answer, and I think it's worth us reflecting on it in that way. This reference to the strong man may be Jesus playing with the name Beelzebub. That was one way in which this Beelzebub character was conceived of, and so it could be that there's a little bit of a reflection of that even there. But one way or another, Jesus is invading, he's on the warpath, he's going to bind this strong man in order to liberate people who have been in bondage to him. Now we come to the next paragraph, which in some people's minds is one of the most dreadful paragraphs in all the Bible. Assuredly, I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the sons of men, and whatever blasphemies they may utter. But he who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is subject to eternal condemnation, because they said he has an unclean spirit. Well, this is one of those texts that some people just, they look at it and they just kind of tremble. An unpardonable sin. And before we think about what that unpardonable sin is, I think we should think, first of all, about what good news is here in this text. I'd like to rehabilitate it slightly, because notice what Jesus says at the beginning. I say to you, all sins will be forgiven, meaning all kinds of sins. There is not one species of sin that is so egregious, so serious, so over the top, so dreadful, so horrible that God's grace cannot cover it. I tell you, a lot of people have committed a lot of bad sins. I've committed a few myself. I'm not going to tell you about them, but they're out there. I take great comfort in this verse. All sins, all kinds of sins, no matter how bad, no matter how ugly, are nevertheless no match for the grace of God. Very encouraging news. There is no sin beyond his reach. But now we have this notable exception that's called blaspheming the Holy Spirit. This has to be understood in light of Jesus' baptism. Jesus, as you know, was baptized by John the Baptist, and at that moment, he had the visible display of what's called his anointing, the Ruach Yahweh, the Spirit of the Lord, came upon Jesus. That's the term that's used in the Old Testament to describe how God would give supernatural power to his agents, his servants. And so we hear of the Ruach Yahweh coming upon Samson, coming upon David, coming upon the prophets. And invariably, when the Spirit of the Lord comes on someone, the effect of it is they can do things that ordinary people cannot do. They can read the future. They can perform great acts of miraculous power. That was the fundamental purpose for the Ruach Yahweh coming on folks in the Old Testament. There was always this anticipation that at a certain time in history, another anointing would happen. The Ruach Yahweh, the Spirit of the Lord, would come on one, but it would be the consummate expression of it. The Messiah with a capital M. The final defining moment in which God pours out in all his fullness his Spirit upon someone so that that one would perform great acts of supernatural power among us. And that's precisely what happened. Jesus receives this anointing. It marks him as the Messiah, and from that point on we begin to see supernatural power. Power that could only be the expression of God's power among us. Anybody looking at the life of Christ with any kind of detached attitude would have immediately gathered this is the power of God. Look at what he's doing. Look at the things he is able to accomplish. This can be nothing other than God's power. Now, if someone comes along and says in the face of that which is obviously God's work among us, that this is the work of the devil, then it requires a couple of things in advance. It requires, number one, that these people making this accusation understand precisely what's going on and indeed believe that it is in fact God's power at work, and then in an expression of almost inexplicable hardness of heart, refuse to acknowledge it and assign the work of God to the devil, you see. It is kind of the flip side of the biblical idea of faith. The Reformers, you may recall, understood faith as three little components. There must be notitia. You have to know something. You have to know the gospel. You can't have faith in a cognitive vacuum. There must be asenkus. There must be assent. You not only have to know the content of the gospel, you must be convinced it's true. And then finally, there is fiducia. There is entrusting yourself to it. There is embracing it. There is loving it. There is making it the guiding principle of your life. And taken together, those three add up to what the Bible calls saving faith. Now, if you have the first two, James says, so far you look more like a demon than a Christian. Demons know the gospel. Demons believe with all their heart it's true. Demons are more orthodox, friends, than anybody in this gymnasium right now. They get it. And they hate it. And somebody who gets it and hates it, somebody who sees the irrefutable, undeniable truth of God, and has no quibble with the fact that it is the truth of God, and then in a simple expression of total heartfelt malevolence toward it says, that's the work of the devil, that's evil, then that person has just signaled that they possess the same state of heart that people will possess in hell for eternity. They've just got that heart in advance of being in that dreadful place. It's very rare. I don't know about you, I've had conversations with a lot of folks over the years who are not believers. I love it. I love to talk to people who are not Christian believers about the Christian faith. Occasionally, I'm not much of an evangelist. Occasionally, I've had people pray with me in that, and many of you have had that wonderful experience as well. Mostly, it doesn't happen that way. Mostly, they just come back and say, well, I just don't think that's quite right. I've never had anybody say this. You're right. The Christian faith is right. Jesus is God's Son. He died on the cross for the sins of people who would believe in Him. And I hate that so much, I'm not going to believe it, even though I know I'm going to spend eternity in hell thinking about it. I've never had someone say that to me. Now, if I did, I might suspect that I was talking to someone who had committed the so-called unpardonable sin. But do you see, it's a kind of self-defining state of mind and heart. There's no mystery anymore. One commentator put it this way, quote, "It is the height of calling evil good and good evil. It allows of no misunderstanding or deception. It shows a permanently hardened and unrepentant heart, a persistent, stubborn refusal to see and perceive, to hear and understand." I think there probably have been people in history who have been guilty of the unpardonable sin. I think it's quite rare, but I think the central purpose of this text should not be to scare us, but to encourage us, because I doubt that anyone in this room has such a state of heart. And for all the rest of us, there is great hope in the grace of God that no other sin we may commit would ever be so overwhelming, but that God wouldn't forgive it. Now, the reason Mark has included this, and we appreciate this little explanatory comment he makes at the end, they had said he has an unclean spirit. And it was that accusation by the scribes that seems to have brought them at least perilously close to the state of mind of someone who would have committed the unpardonable sin. We don't know what the state of their heart was, but it would be that kind of statement that would point in that direction. All right, the last little paragraph here, beginning at verse 31. Then his brothers and his mother came. The family apparently was waiting outside all this time, you know. This whole story is a package. And so they wanted to bind him and take him away. We have this whole interaction with the scribes. They're still outside waiting. Standing outside, they sent to him, calling him, and a multitude was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Look, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." But he answered them, saying, "Who is my mother or my brothers?" And he looked around in a circle at those who sat about him and said, "Here is my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother." Now, I don't know about you, that's an astonishing statement. It would be even more astonishing to us if we were first century Jewish people. It would be almost unbelievable that someone would say what he just said. So we'll look at it briefly in the time we have. Then his brothers and his mother came, standing outside, they sent to him. Of course, we always wonder, who are these brothers? We Protestants have not generally had any objection to the idea that Joseph and Mary had children in their marriage relationship after Jesus was born. So as Protestants, you'll find some that think that's the case, some that don't. But as a rule, in principle, there's not been an objection to that being the case. If you're a Roman Catholic, and I know in this room there are some with a Roman Catholic background, you know that that would be almost blasphemous to suggest that Mary had sexual relationships with her husband after the birth of Jesus, because the perpetual virginity of Mary is one of the cardinal ideas that is associated with what's called the Mariology of the Catholic Church. Without going into some kind of detail on this, it goes back to a very early idea in Catholic history that sex, even in marriage, is tainted. It has a little shadow element to it called concupiscence. And thus, even though it is not sinful, and as long as it's done for the proper purpose, namely procreation, it is justifiable. But even in marriage, it has that little shadow element. This is therefore necessary. It's necessary to protect the purity of Mary, beginning with her Immaculate Conception, right through to her Assumption, from any taint whatsoever, including the taint of concupiscence. Hence, she could never have had sexual relationship with her husband, Joseph. We Protestants, of course, don't necessarily see it that way, and so when we see the word brothers, we assume, well, that may be Jesus' brothers. You know, it may be those who were at least half-brothers of his by virtue of the marriage between Mary and Joseph. Catholics would say, no, this is referring to either his cousins, and sometimes that word could be used in a broader generic sense, or it could be referring to children that Joseph had from a prior marriage. Maybe he was a widower when he married Mary and brought with him what would be step-brothers and stepchildren, and that is, of course, possible. It's a hypothetical possibility. It does avoid the problem for the Catholics, but on the face of it, you have to bring something to the text, a kind of a priori disposition toward the question in order to be forced to reach those conclusions. I hope that makes sense, but I thought we should comment on that at least briefly while we're there. No mention of Joseph. Generally, people assume that somewhere along the line, Joseph died. He just sort of disappears from the story of Jesus, and by now we don't hear him referred to, so we'll assume that he's out of the picture. Jesus' family is out in the waiting room. They've heard about the crowds that are impinging upon Jesus, threatening him. They've made this trip, a significant trip from Nazareth. Now they're reduced to standing out in this waiting room, you see, concerned possibly about Jesus' welfare, wondering maybe, we don't know for sure, about his state of mind. And this therefore introduces the rest of the sandwich, right? So now we're on the other side, the other piece of bread. Well, the multitude says to Jesus, "Look, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." Mark treats the multitude throughout the gospel as a bit of an impediment. The multitude's not letting them in, not escorting them in, not making a way for them, just saying, oh, your people are outside there, you know, but not really offering any help beyond that. They probably said this to him in the midst of his teaching, maybe interrupting a statement, something like that. And then Jesus says this, a bit of a bombshell, well, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? This has at least stood in the history of the Christian movement as standing for the idea that the bond of faith many times exceeds the bond of blood. I know there are those of you in this room who would say you are closer to your brothers and sisters in faith. You have closer bonds to some people who share your Christian faith than you do with any of your siblings. That has been one of the interesting things about the life of faith. It ties us to people more closely than any other human relationship possibly could. And so at least in part, that may be what's suggested here, but there's certainly more going on. This also does raise, again, and I'm not picking on Catholics today, please, it just happened to come up, so here it is. It does raise at least a question about the extraordinary veneration of Mary that is part of common Roman Catholic practice. I have deeply close friends who are Catholics, and so I feel them now. Even now, they're not here, but I can feel their ire. But nevertheless, I think we have to at least say in fairness, this does raise a question. There's maybe a half a dozen texts in the New Testament that at least raise a question whether it is quite as appropriate as our Catholic friends seem to think to engage in the sort of Mariolatry that is part of typical Roman Catholic practice, because at least a moment like this does make you pause. Now, this is not a question about Mary's faith or Mary's virtue or any such thing. It's just that the fact that Jesus would say this in itself at least raises a question about whether or not that status as being his mother is being a little bit overplayed from a Catholic point of view. I'll leave that to your own assessment, but many commentators have noted that about that text. He looked around in a circle at those who sat about him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers." Most commentators believe that he's referring to his disciples. They are the inner circle, but they're not expressly mentioned at this point. And I'm going to use this as an excuse. At least I think part of the force of this must be understood in light of something that amounts to a footnote right now. So, footnote, bottom of the page, a little bit of an excursus here about the first century view of the family. The Jewish world of the first century, and in many ways throughout history, has held marriage in higher esteem, certainly in the first century, held it in much higher esteem than any known pagan culture, period. Marriage had a vastly greater prestige among the Jewish people. So much so that a man who did not marry, who was a confirmed bachelor, was actually viewed as being guilty, nearly as guilty as a man who was a murderer. You were expected to marry. And the pressure on you became increasingly intense, almost to the point of intolerable, if a man didn't marry. Because if he refused to marry, he was violating one of the first commandments God gave, that we should replenish the earth, that we should propagate the species, and so on. And so this was serious business. It was expected for people to marry at a reasonably early age. It was in fact viewed as a little bit suspicious if you waited to be more than 20 years old. Marriage would always be post-puberty, but not much more than that, you see. So teenage marriages were quite common in the first century. There were actually cases where men were forced to marry because they had waited too long for no good reason. That's how vitally important marriage was in the ancient Jewish world. It was a two-step process, as you know, both the engagement period, betrothal, and the so-called home-taking. Infidelity at either stage was punishable by death. It was a capital offense. That's why Joseph, being a just man, not willing to make a public example out of Mary, was wanting to, put her away privately, because he didn't want to expose her to that. He was a man of some compassion, but nevertheless, he couldn't see any way around it. He couldn't believe this nonsense about God did this, God made her pregnant. Come on, Mary, please. Until God himself told Joseph. So you see the drop of this really in many parts of the New Testament. Family obligation was also held in high esteem. Marriage, family, children, greatly celebrated. The value of a wife to a man was highly esteemed. Of course, Proverbs 31 famously celebrates this, but many non-canonical writings went way beyond that. Not quite reaching Paul in Ephesians chapter 5, where a man is to love his wife as Christ loved the church, but not far from it. Granted, first century Jewish culture was highly patriarchal. No one's denying that or disputing it at this point. But given that, there was still this remarkable elevation of the status of the woman in the culture and especially in the married relationship. Thus, Jewish law afforded greater protection generally to women than you would find in the pagan culture. The wife was expected to be not only the homemaker, but the primary educator. She was a homeschool teacher of her children. The only exception was it was the man's duty, may I say it again, it was the man's duty to teach his children the Bible, you see. So that was the one exception to that rule. Based on that, many commentators who've commented on this topic believe the disciples were probably all married, or at least most of them were. Peter certainly was, we know that. It's likely the others were married as well. It's not mentioned in the New Testament because it's not part of the purpose of the New Testament to give us a lot of biographical information about the disciples, but it's highly probable that they were also married. Now that always raises then the question of Jesus, you see. Jewish practice, as I hope you've gathered by now, would have put Jesus in a highly awkward position to be unmarried by the time he was 30 years old. We don't hear about this as an issue in the New Testament, but those who are familiar with the culture would simply assume that had to be the case. That has led some to postulate, well, maybe Jesus was married. The universal conviction of the church and of your Sunday school teacher is that Jesus was not married, you know. But there have been those who thought, otherwise, there'd be some kind of great hullabaloo about this in the New Testament records. The first time we actually hear the hypothesis suggested that Jesus was married is in a 4th century papyrus called the Jesus Wife Papyrus. It's a Gnostic writing, but it does make reference to Jesus being married. It is suggested impliedly in a couple of earlier Gnostic documents, certainly not in the New Testament, but it is at least an idea that was bouncing around even early with respect to this. As I say, the conviction of the church, both Protestant and Catholic and Eastern, the whole testimony of the church has been that Jesus was not married, and I don't think we need to entertain that too seriously. But it does raise a question, you know, how did Jesus deal with the social pressure that must have been on him? Others have suggested Jesus didn't marry because he was considered illegitimate. And it was illegal for an illegitimate person to marry in legitimate Jewish society. The stigma of illegitimacy did attach to Jesus, as you probably know. There's texts in the New Testament that at least hint at it strongly enough that it's there. Certainly the idea that Joseph married Mary when she was already pregnant was a word that had gotten out. People knew that. So there was a kind of hint of a scandal of illegitimacy about Christ, and that maybe that's why it's not so much of an issue in the New Testament, because he would have been prevented from marrying for that very reason. By the way, that rule in Jewish society against illegitimates marrying was based on, I think, a misreading of Deuteronomy 23:3, where we find a reference to Ammonites and Moabites. Bottom line, Jewish culture held family to be of the highest possible importance. And thus, when Jesus made his statement, "Here is my mother, here are my brothers," it would be taken as a breathtaking departure from accepted Jewish culture. But interestingly, it became foundational for a very different principle that is followed down through history. Not that we don't esteem marriage very, very highly as Christians, obviously we do, but that even more deep we find in this bond of faith, that which creates a true and deep spiritual family. Jesus concludes, "Whoever does the will of God is my brother, my sister, and my mother." All right, quickly. Sunday school lesson. 3 questions for you this morning. Number 1, are you out of your mind? Have you had a mental health checkup lately with respect to whether you are quite balanced because you're so fiercely devoted to Christ? We're Presbyterians. One of the reasons I'm a Presbyterian is because I think we do things decently and orderly, and we like to be respectable. And those are all good things, so I'm not challenging that at all. But there is a place for a little bit of imbalance. I want to be unbalanced, friends, when it comes to my devotion to Christ. I want to be unbalanced to the point that is the most important single thing in my life and in death, whatever you threaten me with. I say this by the grace of God, I hope, that whatever it may be, you're not going to separate me from that one who I have devoted my life to. That's not very balanced. It may look to some people like you're a little bit out of your mind. But in some ways, that's at the heart of a true Christian spirit. Are you out of your mind for Jesus? Are you at war with Satan with Jesus? The sword that comes out of the mouth of the rider on the horse beats back the gates of hell, and he's given you that sword. It is his word. Do you pepper your life with his word? In every conversation, whether inside the church or out, do you find excuses to bring God's word into this conversation somehow or other? Its potency should never be underestimated. And when you do that, you are engaging in this war. You are extending the binding of the strong man in your life, in the lives of your neighbors, in the lives of brothers and sisters in Christ, in the lives of those with you work with. All of these are places where the warfare can continue. And finally, are you brother, sister, or mother to Jesus? I loved Betsy's eloquent, wonderful sermon last week in which she commented on God is our Father. Jesus is our brother. We have been made family members. We are royalty on steroids. We are the most unspeakable people of privilege in the universe, because we have been made joint heirs with Christ. Do we really appreciate who we are? Brother, sister, mother to Jesus because of our devotion to him. There's no place in our lives for a kind of, overly apologetic attitude. We are humble, we're modest, we're not arrogant, not conceited, but nevertheless we have a deep, deep sense that we are God's family, and that gives us a special privilege and a special capacity to be compassionate as we invite others to join the family.